WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM's Master of Business Administration is designed to accommodate the career needs of professionals across a variety of work organizations. More information at business.udmercy.edu.
On 101.9 WDET FM, I'm Tia Graham, and here with us this week is Malachi Barrett, reporter with Bridge Detroit. Once again, thanks for being here with us this week. And what's happening on the show?
Today on the program, we are talking about the site of the former Algiers Motel receiving a historical marker coming up on Friday, which will commemorate it as the site of police brutality during the 1967 Detroit Rebellion. We're going to talk with a civil rights historian who has advocated for the installation of the marker.
Plus, Detroit almost became home to the 1968 Olympics, but anti-black discrimination and segregation brought protesters to the streets to halt the event's arrival. We'll talk with filmmakers of a new documentary about that moment in time in Detroit.
But first up on the Metro, 90% of Detroit's rental properties don't comply with city regulations. Let's just sit on that for a second. The vast majority of the buildings that renters live in are not in compliance, according to city rules, and half of the city's population are renters. Part of the reason for this is because it's really hard for smaller landlords to be compliant with city rules. So on Monday, Mayor Mike Duggan and Councilmember Mary Waters proposed overhauling the city's rental laws. They want to ease the cost and some of the bureaucratic hurdles associated with the inspection process. Here to talk with us about why the landlords struggle to be compliant with city codes and how this new strategy is meant to improve access to quality, affordable housing is David Bowser. He's the deputy director of the city's Housing and Revitalization Department. Director Bowser, thank you for joining us today on the Metro.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much.
I want to start just by playing a cut from the press conference that was held on Monday with Mayor Duggan.
We hired 20 inspectors we sent out. The last 5 years, those 20 inspectors wrote 100,000 violation tickets. We introduced a new escrow ordinance, which was groundbreaking at the time, to provide people who were not getting the repairs done the ability to put their rent payments in escrow and not be evicted. And after 5 years, only 10% of the rental units in the city were in compliance. And then Council Member Mary Waters came to me, and she said, I appreciate all the effort, but we're not being successful. And she reminded me of Bill Clinton's line that the definition of insanity was continuing to do the same thing over and over and expect different results.
So Mayor Duggan mentions there's some things the city's done, including hiring some inspectors to write tickets and introduce an escrow ordinance. Before getting into what the changes are, can you tell us a little bit about what the inspectors and the escrow ordinance did, and then why didn't that work in bringing our rental properties up to code?
Yeah, I think really what happened is the certificate of compliance process was so sort of onerous to comply with that those tickets didn't really drive success at all. If the end result was a process that landlords cannot even afford to participate in, then we weren't really making the process accessible to landlords and ultimately for residents who are looking for permanent housing options that were safe, clean, and decent. And so by sort of modifying and standardizing their certificate of compliance process, we're making this a lot more accessible to our smaller mom and pop landlords who are looking to comply. We're making it cheaper for them. We're simplifying the process tremendously. And now, hopefully, we can have more landlords come into compliance, which creates better housing options for residents who are looking for safe, clean, and decent housing. And so what we've also done with that is we're looking to upgrade and standardize the escrow process as well. So there were significant barriers to qualify for escrow for tenants on the other side of this. And so we want to make that process a lot more simple and tailor it to the experience of resident Detroiters. Many individuals may not have a written lease. Many individuals may not have a physical ID. Many individuals may live in multifamily housing as opposed to single-family housing. All these were barriers that really decrease the number of people that could actually qualify for escrow should they encounter a landlord who was not in compliance. And so we're making it easier for landlords to qualify and to sort of obtain a CFC, and then we're increasing BC's outreach and to make sure that units are compliant, and we're also making it easier for residents to qualify for the escrow program so that they can have those protections for landlords who are not compliant.
So there's a lot of pieces to this, obviously. I think the ordinance that was introduced in City Council is something like 75 pages. So we're going to break it down piece by piece. Explain to our listeners, what is a certificate of compliance? What does that mean, and why is that important?
So it's a certification that allows tenants or potential tenants to understand and know that the unit that they're looking at is safe, clean, and decent, and that it meets inspection criteria set forth by the city of Detroit. And so, the benefit is right now, many individuals are finding housing by sort of knowing someone that knows someone, essentially. And what those housing options typically are, they may not have, we're seeing many residents who are in units that don't have, central air. They may not have had an inspection to make sure that the property conditions are feasible for anyone living, that the porches are in disrepair, utilities may not be on. This inspection criteria will make sure that there are some basic health and safety inspection points that are covered so that when potential tenants are looking for housing options, we know that they're able to, live safely in that home. Right now, because 90% of the rental units in Detroit are not certified, we don't know that they meet those criteria at all, and residents are moving into spaces that are oftentimes dangerous. And those sort of situations end up possibly physically harming individuals, or they may end up in eviction because some of these units are not actually owned by the individuals that are renting them out. And so the certificate of compliance will really standardize the housing search for tenants who are looking for good landlords, and it will guarantee that the unit that they've identified meets those core health and safety inspections.
Is it fair to say that a rental property that doesn't have a certificate of compliance is operating illegally?
It is operating against city code, for sure. And then BC again will go ahead and ticket that unit that does not have a certificate of compliance. So it is against city code. It will result in a ticket, and residents right now who have issues or who have property concerns as tenants can certainly call BC and have an inspector come out to look at that unit.
And it sounds like what we've found is that these tickets are not necessarily getting properties into compliance. The city issued 33,000 tickets in 2023. We were told that the city collects a fraction of those fees, and maybe more importantly, tickets rarely result in a property coming into compliance after that. So if enforcement doesn't really seem to be working, how do we compel landlords to follow the rules? I know some of this is aimed around making it easier for smaller landlords to get into compliance, but for those kind of bad actors that maybe are ignoring tickets or avoiding the inspection process, what do we do about those folks?
Well, we really have to start talking about the benefits of compliance for landlords in particular. And so the city and many of the city's partners now have programs where they are supporting residents, connecting them to employment, maybe even paying first month's rent and security deposit. Those programs all need a pipeline of compliant landlords to route residents that we are supporting to. And so as you are a landlord and thinking about, the pros of complying, what it really could mean is a new relationship with the city of Detroit where you are having residents routed to you who have those case management supports. And so obviously the other side of that is actually operating legally as a landlord in Detroit should be a carrot there as well. But you sort of open yourself up to the city looking to standardize the housing search, creating a database of compliant landlords and having residents who have employment supports or even in some cases vouchers routed directly to you so that you can guarantee that sort of, second income. If you are a mom and pop landlord, even a larger landlord, you can guarantee that income by having by standardizing and bringing your units into compliance and then having residents routed to you through the city and our other partners. So there's quite a few benefits for landlords to come into compliance. Obviously, the benefits for tenants as well, as we can start to create a database of compliant landlords and then begin to again route individuals directly to those compliant landlords.
So under the current system, some of the checkpoints on the inspection list are cosmetic and unrelated to health and safety, as we've been told. And this inspection revamp would basically remove some of the unnecessary inspection points. How does the city scale back what it's looking for during these inspections while also ensuring that tenants are still living in safe conditions? We're streamlining the checklist, but also keeping the important stuff, it sounds like.
Absolutely. We really had to look at standardizing the expectation that the city has for landlords. By standardizing, we mean looking at national standards. Other cities have utilized the same metrics that we're looking to implement, and they have had much higher compliance rates, much lower lead poisoning rates, and overall better systems for potential tenants in their cities. And so we're really aligning what we are expecting here in Detroit with the successes of other similarly situated cities to make sure that we have a good balance of compliance and accessibility. And then also, I think one unique thing that Detroit is doing is also surrounding the certificate of compliance process with other programs and other protections for tenants. And so based on national practices, I think that we are trending in the right direction. Where Detroit has been is really on the far end of this bell curve of sort of compliance measures across the country, where those compliance measures are so high that most landlords could not comply, even if they were being ticketed consistently by BC. And so how do we make sure that we can make this accessible without jeopardizing health and safety? We have looked at and talked to, our local lead advocates. We've talked to medical doctors. We've worked with the health department. We are making sure that these inspection criteria do not, fall short of national standards to protect health and safety as we look to implement these changes.
We are chatting with David Bowser. He's the Deputy Director of the City of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department, talking about changes to rental inspection rules in the City of Detroit. Tell us a little bit about how tenants can report issues to the city. I understand there's a hotline where people can forward complaints to the city. How tell folks how to do that, and what have we learned since establishing that hotline about some of the common issues that people are running into?
Yeah, absolutely. So the city has sort of looked to centralize many of the housing resources that residents across the city need. And so any resident can call the Detroit Housing Resource Helpline at 866-313-2520. When you call that number, there's an option for renters and for tenants. Within that option, you'll be able to report property conditions directly to the Building Safety, Engineering, and Environmental Department of the city. And so any resident can call that number. What BC does is they check those submissions and they schedule an inspection to your unit. And so we've really been seeing a few different things. One is many residents are falling victim to sort of landlords who may not even own the property that they're renting out, falling victim to fraud, essentially. And so one thing that we're looking to do, even after or during the process of approving the certificate of compliance changes, is also increasing the type of education and the ways that we educate potential tenants across the city of Detroit. As you're looking for a landlord, how do you make sure that landlord actually owns the home? Obviously, adding the certificate of compliance piece is another part of that puzzle as you're looking for a landlord as well. But we need to make sure that tenants have the resources they need to know that they're paying the correct person. Again, that's part of the standardization of the housing search that we're looking to facilitate there.
Mm-hmm. It's astounding to me that so many folks are potentially living in homes that are not actually owned by the person they're paying rent to. I have a lot more questions for you, Mr. Bowser, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you so much for being with us today on the Metro.
Great. Happy to be here. Thank you so much.
This is the Metro on 101.9 WDET-FM. You just heard from Malachi Barrett chatting with David Bowser from Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department. And coming up, the Algiers Motel. It was the site of a violent police brutality in 1967, which helped spark Detroit toward rebellion. We'll talk with a historian about that moment in Detroit's history and the arrival of the new marker that explains that history in the space where the Algiers Motel used to exist. That's coming up on the Metro. to the Metro here on 101.9 WDET FM. I am Tia Graham, and I am here with
Malachi Barrett.
Yes, indeed, from Bridge, Detroit. Once again, thank you for being here with us this week.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much for having me. Fun discussions, I think. Some good news, hopefully, for folks listening.
Exactly. And now we're going to give them a little bit of a history lesson. The history of the city of Detroit is rich with stories. Whether it's narratives about Civil War sites in Detroit's Black Bottom neighborhood, or Motown's greats or indigenous people who originally navigated this land, the history is rich. And a history lesson I was often taught growing up was Detroit's '67 rebellion. My father, a native of Detroit, watched tanks line his streets as neighborhoods burned, and he was 9 years old. Now, nearly 60 years later, a historic marker will be placed at the former location of the Algiers Motel, which was the site of the police violence during the 1967 Detroit riot. A dedication ceremony on Friday will honor the 57th anniversary of the motel raid that resulted in the deaths of 3 Black teenagers and the beatings of at least 6 others. Joining the show now to talk more about the historical marker and preserving the history of the 1967 rebellion is civil rights historian Danielle McGuire. Dr. McGuire, welcome to the Metro.
Thanks for having me.
Indeed. So you've worked for 8 years to get a historic marker for the Algiers Hotel. What was it like?
Well, it's a long process. It started with just community members and local activists kind of imagining what that empty space where the motel once stood could actually be. And over time, we realized, since we didn't own that land, it couldn't be what we hoped it could be. But we did finally come to the conclusion that it could be something important. Mm-hmm. And that led us to a state historical marker. So we worked with local people who live on Virginia Avenue through the Block Club. And we worked with people who were impacted at that site and their family members and descendants. And, of course, dug through lots of archives and found all the information we needed to produce the text for the marker. And then we applied, we had it approved, and then it took about a year and a half for the company that makes the markers to actually create it. So it's been a process, but we're really excited about what it might portend for our future.
And Dr. McGuire, why was it so important for you to get this done?
Well, it was really important for me, one, because I really care about the history and I care about telling the truth about the past. The fact that the Algiers Motel has been, the site where it was, has been empty for decades was to me a kind of an absence, a kind of denial of history, another kind of trauma to the people who were who shed their blood there, who were murdered there. And, just in doing research about 67 and the people who were killed, I found so many places where they were killed, those buildings have been torn down. And so these are kind of ghost landscapes in Detroit. And when you have an empty space where that is a site of violence and it goes unacknowledged for years and years, I believe it adds to the trauma of the people who suffered there and to the community. So a historical marker is a way to bring a presence back to that space that has been empty for so long, where so many people know, something awful happened there. It's a kind of memorial for the 3 teenagers who were killed there and the 6 others who were beaten and brutalized there. And I think, in creating a new narrative about that space, restoring presence to that space, it gives us the opportunity to tell the truth about the past and to heal from that trauma, to provide some kind of repair, both for the victims and their descendants, but also for all of us.
Yeah. So, Dr. McGuire, I did have a chance to speak with my dad for this segment. Like you heard a little bit earlier in the intro, he was around during that time. And I want to play a cut of when he grew up in the neighborhood and saw everything that was happening.
Well, it was a Sunday afternoon when it started on Grand River in the area I lived in. It was started with a few guys throwing rocks, and then they started breaking windows. And then within about half an hour. It was full-scale rebellion. I was 9 years old at the time, so I lived right 2 houses off Grand River, so you could see Grand River and what was going on since it was a major street back in those days with a lot of businesses. It was pretty rough that first night. It was a lot of fears.
And, I think about that. What led up to the 67 rebellions as we're talking about it?
Oh, gosh, there were so many things. I mean, broadly speaking, a legacy of white supremacy, a legacy of unequal housing, unequal access to jobs for Black citizens, unequal policing, police violence, you name it, right? All of the things that we think about when we think about, let's say, segregation in Mississippi, the same was true in Detroit. And so you had a real problems with racial inequality and poverty that led to a sense of people being fed up. There were all of these promises of change coming through the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think people were hoping that there would be some change in places like Detroit, but there just wasn't the kind of change coming fast enough that people could, hold on to. And that sense of hope coupled with the lack of change, coupled with, endemic police violence led to an outburst of violence that people, I think, rightly call a rebellion.
And Dr. McGuire, just building off of that and hearing you talk about, the promise of hope for better days, I guess you can say, especially as those were coming from the Great Migration from the South, moving up to the North, hoping for less segregation, less police brutality, just better conditions in general. If you can expand on that just a little bit, the idea of hope and coming to another space and place and finding it being very similar to the place that they left.
Right. I think you had a lot of people who were here, who were native to Detroit, but you also had people who were coming from the South, trying to leave the violence and the lack of opportunity in the South because of white supremacy and racial segregation, and finding, similar difficulties here in Detroit. So, Rosa Parks, probably one of the more famous migrants from the Deep South, came in 1957 after the Montgomery bus boycott. And she said, she came because she thought it was a promised land, but she said it was a promised land that wasn't. She struggled to find adequate housing. She struggled to find adequate employment. And she was forced to live in neighborhoods where only Black people were allowed to live. She couldn't go out to the suburbs. She was part of, open housing movements in Detroit, the same kind of, anti-segregation movements she was involved in Alabama. So I think that, expecting it to be better and realizing that in lots of ways it was similar to segregation in the South made people want to fight against it. Detroit had one of the largest NAACPs in the entire country, and they really helped lead the charge from really, I would say, the 1930s through the 40s, 50s, and into the 1960s and 70s. So you had discrimination and inequality, but you also had extraordinary Black organization and resistance to that inequality. And it's why you have such a rich Black history in Detroit of resistance, of cultural competency and power, and wealth building.
Right now, we are chatting with Dr. Danielle McGuire, a public speaker, author, and civil rights historian, and we're going to bring Malachi into the conversation.
Dr. McGuire, I was interested in, the legacy of this event. I think there's a lot of white residents in the metro region, and particularly throughout the state of Michigan, who don't understand really the forces that led to the rebellion. And I'm wondering, why do you think that's the case here in 2024? Do you think it has to do with the continued kind of segregation that we see in communities? Do you think it has to do with how we teach Black history in schools? Why is this still kind of an understood event?
Yeah, it's all of those things and more. We don't teach history in our public schools. We definitely don't teach Black history the way it needs to be taught. That's been an ongoing problem. It's getting worse. We still live in a starkly divided society and a starkly segregated society, even in a place as diverse as Michigan in the Metro Detroit area, right? But we also tend to not want to tell hard histories. We don't want to talk about painful parts of the past, parts that make people uncomfortable. And I think that's part of the reason why even when we talk about the 1967 uprising, we tend to talk about it, in numbers, right? We lost this many buildings. It cost this much money to repair the damage. And we don't talk about the very real harms to people's lives and what they endured and what was lost for all kinds of people, right? Particularly those who were killed during that time, specifically in my case, talking about the 3 victims of the Algiers Motel raid by the Detroit Police Department and other officers. They were teenagers. They didn't just lose their lives. Their families lost sons, cousins, brothers, right? They lost a future. Yeah. And their families were on one path, they were on one road, they were all together. And the murder of Fred Temple and Carl Cooper and Aubrey Pollard put them on a whole different road, one none of them had planned to go on. And some of those roads, led to despair and darkness, and terrible things happened to their families. It was, that violence is like, it can be like a tsunami that totally transforms people's lives, not just the victims, right? There's lots of people victimized by single acts of violence. So, that's a hard story to tell. It's easier to focus on buildings lost, fires, insurance premiums, when we talk about the past that way. But it's more important that we talk about the human cost and the ways in which those harms have not ever fully been recognized. And I think because we haven't fully recognized them, it's part of the reason why we're still stuck in a past that we haven't fully grappled with or told the truth about. So the Algiers Motel marker and memorialization is really an attempt to tell the truth about a hard history that will hopefully lead to healing and, conversation that can bring us closer together.
I appreciate you bringing that up because that's where I wanted to go next. The idea that, we've been having a conversation in this country for the last few years about what history to uphold and what history to discard. And it's interesting, the idea of acknowledging and recognizing hard things that happened in the past and telling the truth about them as a path forward to healing. I mean, in the context of reckoning with, nastier elements of America's history, just further emphasize for us why it's important that we not shy away, that we look directly at instances like this.
Well, we can't look away. If we look away, if we forget, we don't learn. And if we don't learn, we continue doing the same things over and over again. I mean, one of my arguments essentially is that, because there was never any kind of accountability for the kinds of police brutality cases that we saw at the Algiers Motel and throughout the 1967 uprising and afterwards in places like Detroit, right, we still have a problem with police brutality today. When police are held unaccountable for murder and for taking the lives of people unjustly, they continue to do it. And so we're still talking about that problem today, I think, because we haven't fully grappled with the reality of their impunity for so long. This is just one case in lots of cases in Detroit, but also in the rest of the country. But it's an important case because human beings were involved, and those human beings had family members and people, kin who still live in the area and still live in that loss. So, when you have an empty space, like where, something horrible happened and you leave it empty, it's like it's an open wound, right? It's another kind of trauma. The lack of acknowledgement, the silence surrounding a site of violence does more harm, right? In my opinion. And so talking about it, telling the truth about it, recognizing the harms, acknowledging that hard history, it's only through that process that we can go about building something better.
And Dr. McGuire, just wanted to stick to the human aspect that you're talking about right now, I just wanted to play one more clip from my dad because we wanted to talk about how it all shaped people, especially how it shaped the young people of that time. When he talked about it, he was 9 years old, so that's a very impressionable age. And I think about some of the young people at that time who went on to become leaders of the Black Panther Party or LGBTQ plus movements or feminism movements. I just want to play this clip really quickly and then go into the next question.
No, at 9 years old, you knew what was happening because, it was a lot of unrest in the country in 67. It was the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of stuff going on everywhere else. It was Watts. It was, so yes, we knew what was going on even at 9 years old.
How did the rebellion shape the youth of that time from your research and just everything that you've been able to collect? What really happened for them?
I mean, it's a general question. I think you saw lots of different things happening. I mean, some people saw, the violence that was used to shut down the rebellion, and they lost hope. They lost, a sense of possibility. They saw police, the courts, the institutions that are supposed to protect people. They saw them fail in those basic jobs, and that led people to lose hope. Some other people saw that same thing, and they went and tried to fix it, right? Try to make it better. Try to make America live up to its promise. I think a lot of young people were disillusioned, and a lot of some use that disillusionment to be part of a solution, and some kind of use that disillusionment and they dropped out of society. They turn to other things. So I think that you have lots of different responses to that time period, positive and negative. And what I try to do as a historian is pull out those individual threads of people, like what happened specifically, to the families of the victims of the Algiers Motel, and how did that singular event upend so many people's lives, and then take those individual stories and put it into a larger context of what it means for America, what it means for a city like Detroit, and what it means for the future.
I want to say thank you to Dr. Danielle McGuire, civil rights historian, author, as well as public speaker, for joining the Metro and giving us a little bit of background history about Algiers Motel and everything with the 1967 rebellion. The historic marker ceremony is happening at the former site of the Algiers Motel. It's this Friday, July 26th, from 1 to 2 p.m. It's in that New Center area now. Dr. McGuire, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Coming up, Detroit almost became home to the 1968 Olympics, but anti-black discrimination and segregation brought protesters to the streets to halt the event's arrival. We'll talk with filmmakers of a new documentary about that moment in time in Detroit's history.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I am Tia Graham, joined by Malachi Barrett. And Malachi, often we as journalists, we cover very heavy topics, very heavy stories, mentally a lot to process when we're learning about them and ultimately reporting it out to audiences. So my question to you as a journalist is, how do you approach these tough stories?
You got to start with empathy, right? You need to start with understanding. I think you need to let yourself feel it, let yourself be human, and understand that, difficult conversations and recognizing tragedy and being in these kinds of tough conversations is not supposed to be easy. And I think that's important to kind of drive, your intentionality through that process.
Yeah, being comfortable with being uncomfortable is basically what that is. And how do you process mentally, like decompress or take care of yourself, especially once the story's out and you're done and you're away from it?
I mean, it sounds kind of cliche. I go on walks, ride my bike around, try to get some nature in me, try to spend time with friends and family. I think it's bad to disassociate into social media or escape into things. I think it's important to be around other people and maybe even share that with them, explain why it's a difficult day.
Yeah, indeed. I think I'm pretty similar with everything that's been happening in the world. You just try to shut it off for a little bit, take a walk, like you said, get some fresh air, some sunshine on your skin, maybe even eat some ice cream. That's one of my favorite things to do, to eat some ice cream. But just with all the heavy topics that are happening right now, we think about politics and how all politics technically is local. It affects and impacts all of us. And so much of it exists in our city right now. And that means that much responsibility befalls American cities. And while they aren't tasked with doing it alone, they are epicenters for resolving enormous problems, including things like poverty and racism and segregation. But what can cities do to resolve these issues? And what is the role big events play in alleviating social unrest? In recent years, Detroit has been home to a lot of large events. The NFL Draft was recently in town, and huge celebrities like Taylor Swift, Drake, and Beyonce have rode through, and that's not unique for this city. Decades ago, in the 1960s, Detroit made a bid for an enormous event, the Olympics. It was a time when anti-Black discrimination and segregation were creating a lot of turmoil for residents. Detroit ultimately lost the bid to host the Olympics, but the story of how the city almost won the bid and the reasons it didn't, and the possibilities of what could have happened if it did achieve it, are still relevant to this day. With the Olympics starting this week in Paris, we decided to invite the filmmakers of a new documentary about Detroit's 1968 Olympic bid to discuss these things. We have Stefan Szymanski, and is director of Detroit's Olympic Uprising. Stefan, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, also with us is the documentary's writer, Silke Weineck. Silke, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you so much for having us. Thrilled to be here.
Yeah.
So Detroit tried to host the Olympics actually a few times before 1968. Why did the city fail so many times in their efforts, Stefan?
Oh, that's a great question. So, they first bid to host the Games back in they made the bid in 1939 to host the 1944 Olympics. And after the war, they kept trying and failing. And there were several problems that the city was never addressing, particularly the need to build an Olympic stadium. But also, they had this long-term hostility from the guy who became the president of the International Olympic Committee, Avery Brundage, who was born in Detroit, but somehow never wanted the city to get the Games.
Right? That's odd.
Yeah, can you tell us more about why? This guy's a hater.
Well, he was related. So he was born in Detroit, but he moved very early on to Chicago, and he was a very successful businessman. And it's not entirely clear why he hated Detroit, but something to do with the nature of the city, something to do with the brashness of the city put him off. He was very much an old-fashioned, almost you might call a Victorian kind of guy who was into amateurism and the purity of sport, and didn't really like the way that Detroit was trying to present itself as this kind of what it was really back in the day, which is the industrial heart of the world, right? The home of the car, an iconic city. He just didn't like any of that about the city, it seems.
I would like to add that Stefan is too polite. Every Brundage was a piece of work. His nickname was Slavery Avery.
Oh, wow.
He stripped Jesse Owens of amateur status to punish him for not falling in line after the Nazi Olympics. And the only reason that America competed in the Nazi Olympics was Avery Brundage. They sent him to Berlin, say, well, we hear these things about how Hitler's Germany isn't, there's some problems there. And every Brundage went, oh, no, it's fine. They assured me, of course the Jewish athletes will compete. We absolutely must go. I mean, that guy was a problem.
And he was very much an opponent of civil rights. And he was also hated President Kennedy, who in 1963 was backing Detroit's bid for the Games. So there's a lot of reasons why that very bad man didn't really want Detroit to get it.
So, Silke, Jerome Kavanaugh, he was a mayor in Detroit during the 1960s, very much wanted the Olympics to come to Detroit. I want to play a clip from the documentary of his son, Mark Kavanaugh, talking about that.
Dad's purpose in becoming mayor and his vision for Detroit was making it the greatest city in the United States. The Olympics were a piece of the puzzle.
Why did Mayor Kavanaugh want the Olympics so bad, and why did he believe it would turn Detroit into a world-class city? Zilka, we're going to start with you.
Sure. Well, I mean, Detroit in the middle of the century was a world-class city, right? It was the capital of the 20th century. But in the early 60s, it had started its decline, right? Population was leaving, industry was leaving, so the crisis was kind of underway, right? And he wanted to stop it. He wanted to restore Detroit to its glory as the arsenal of democracy, right? As the industrial center of the U.S., and he thought getting the vast international exposure, right, you get from hosting the Olympics would really raise the profile of the city again. And he was generally seen as somebody who might become president himself, right? He had amazing press. He was meant to be the guy who was solving the so-called urban crisis, right? So he wanted glory, but he also generally thought that this would be good for Detroit, right? Would bring money to Detroit, would bring prestige to Detroit. He just, I don't think, or we think that he just didn't understand the depth of the problem, the depth of the anger and despair, right? And so, he just fell short. He didn't see it coming.
And the same thing goes to you, Stefan. What were some of the things that you were seeing as you were putting the film together about Mayor Kavanaugh and his need and want for the Olympics to come to the city?
Well, one thing to remember about Mayor Kavanaugh is that when he was elected, he was very much a surprise package, and he didn't have the backing of the political establishment, but what he did have was the backing of the black community in Detroit, and that was the reason that he got elected. And there was this sense that he, as a progressive, he was then going to do things to address fundamental issues in Detroit, which, listening to your previous segment, that people, we still talk about today: police brutality, housing, educational opportunities, and he was going to address this. And he did some things. I mean, in fairness to him, he tried to do some things. But on the other hand, he got, like a lot of politicians, he got attracted by this shiny object, the Olympics. The idea the Olympics was going to bring the focus of the world's attention on you. You were going to be this in the spotlight. And he thought, as a kind of very optimistic guy, thought that this would in itself solve Detroit's issues, or would itself be a huge boost for the city? And that's one of the questions we try to pose at the end of the documentary, is say, well, is that really true? And it's a great what if. We can't be sure one way or the other. It could have been a good thing. It might not have been such a good thing.
Right now, we're chatting with the creators of the documentary film Detroit's Olympic Uprising, which was recently screened at the University of Michigan's Detroit Center. We will return with this conversation in one moment. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET-FM. I'm Tia Graham here with Malachi Barrett of Bridge Detroit, and we're continuing the conversation about how Detroit almost got the 1968 Olympics and the reason it did not. Malachi, we're going to continue this conversation.
Yeah, so we're here talking with creators of the documentary film Detroit's Olympic Uprising, which was recently screened at the University of Michigan's Detroit Center. Many activists in Detroit were against bringing the Olympics to the city, and we were talking about some of the forces behind that earlier. I want to play this clip from the documentary from Marygrove professor Charles Simmons, who was an activist in Detroit around the time.
There was some discussion about it in the barbershops and beauty parlors and in church. Among the people who I was around, it was discussed as something that was absurd given the contradictions that existed in the city. We were just discovering the depth of racism in the North, and it was shocking. And when they started talking about bringing the Olympics, which represented brotherhood, at the same time they're talking about maintaining segregation, it was too much of a contradiction. And so we took to the streets.
Zilke, tell us more about the experiences of black residents in Detroit in the 60s and why many of them were against holding the Olympics here while these issues were addressed.
Yeah, it feels a little weird as a German immigrant to be asked about the black experience in Detroit in the 60s. But we had this fantastic privilege of talking to Charles Simmons and to Luke Tripp, and to watch clips of General Baker, right, who was a major force at the time. John Williams, who was also part of Yahoo, of the protesting group, came to the screening last night. And it was just really moving to see these guys who went up against the entire power structure, right? The mayor, the governor, JFK himself, the entire industrial leadership of Detroit, right? And there's this bunch of 19, 20-year-olds at Wayne State, and they go like, no, right? This city is just not worthy. And the context of that, I mean, this was a more general point they were making, but very specifically in 1963, two things happened. The policeman murdered Cynthia Scott on the street, shot her in the back. The killing was immediately covered up and exonerated, and Kavanaugh was a part of that. And people were furious. I mean, it wasn't the first police killing or first police brutality, but it really galvanized the community. And then very shortly before they went to Baden-Baden to present their bid to the Olympic Committee, City Council voted 7-2 to maintain legal housing segregation in Detroit against Kavanaugh's wishes, right? But 7-2, right? And I think that was the final straw. And so Kavanaugh had organized this fantastic big press event. People were carrying the Olympic torch from L.A. to Detroit, right, over the course of 2 weeks. And the last runner was Hayes Jones, a hurdler from Pontiac. And he was meant to present the torch to Kavanaugh on the steps of City Hall, and the press is there, and the police band is there, and it was meant to be the crowning event. And Yahoo, this group of activists shows up with their signs, is this segregated city ready to host the Olympics? No, right? And they boo, and the whole thing descends into chaos, right? And that got a lot of press, but not the press they wanted. And Kavanaugh and the Detroit justice system actually sued these guys. They prosecuted them not just once, but twice for booing the national anthem. We could not find any precedent for that. And these guys were right. I mean, they had a very good point, right?
Silke, thank you so much for that. Before we let you go, though, we just want to talk a little bit more about the film itself, the screening of the film, and where people can actually find it to go watch it. That is Detroit's Olympic Uprising.
Yes. So we are in final negotiations it will air on WJBK. We think on August 3rd, but it's not completely wrapped up. It will also stream on their website, and we will host other screenings in the city and here where we are in Ann Arbor. One major force behind the film was our editor, Aaron Schillinger. So I just want to give a shout out to Aaron, who in the end put it all together. We're academics, we're eggheads. We don't know how to actually make a film, right? So we would love to find a way to keep everybody posted. We have a website. It's called OlympicUprising.com. One word, OlympicUprising.com, and we will post the times there.
Well, let us know what we could do here at WDET to work in conjunction with you all to get that film screened. Right. But thank you so much for being here, Stefan Szymanski, the director of Detroit's Olympic Uprising, and Silke Weineck is the director's writer. Thank you both for joining us on the Metro, and the documentary was screened last night at the University of Michigan's Detroit Center. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. This is great. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's the Metro for Wednesday, July 24. You can listen to this recent episode online at WDET.org, and make sure you subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. Mine's Spotify. The show is also on YouTube if you like listening that way.
Spotify is for me as well. The show is produced by Sam Corey, David Lyons, and Jack Philbrandt. Additional production support by Anil Scott and Sydney Walkley. Our engineer is Nate Bender, and music's done by Sam Bobian and Will Sessions.
The Metro is a production of WDET, listener-supported service of Wayne State University. If you like what you hear and you want to support the Metro, consider becoming a member at wdet.org/donate.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. Thanks for listening. I'm Tia Graham. Malachi Barrett returns tomorrow.
WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM is offering a new master's degree in ethical leadership focused on sustainable, ethical, and inclusive problem solving. More information at business.udmercy.edu.